Okay, thank you everybody. Sorry for the confusion, the technical challenges, but it looks like this is all sorted. We can carry on now. So this session we're discussing SABS, SANS, and I'm Herman Strauss. I'll be your presenter for today. You don't need to know too much about me. I can tell you that I think for most of my career I've been dealing with standards. I've worked for SABS for about 25 odd years. I've been there different at various stages of SABS. I worked with SABS for that period of time. Some of the time was working for them. I've worked for other organizations where I was a client of SABS and other international organizations like that. So at least I had some experience that brought me to the point where I can discuss this with you today. So if only I can get my screen working. Just a quick overview of what we will be discussing today. We're going to discuss why standards. What is a standard? How does the South African and the international requirements standards link up to each other, or how do they compare? Legal status of standards, very important. The process of writing a standard. Then the heading of this thing, what is SABS, what is SANS, and a quick word about compliance. But what's the objective? The objective of this whole session, we'd like to try and help you develop an appreciation of the value of standards, because there's a lot of value in standards. To help you to understand who decides what go into a standard, who writes the standards, where does it come from? To understand the meaning of compliance to standards, what does it mean to comply with the standard? And then obviously who and what is SABS and SANS. But I'd like to start with a little poll. If you can answer this question, just to give a general idea of what we're dealing with, what your perceptions are. So what is your perception of standards? Waste of time, I know what I'm doing. It's good for other areas, not necessarily for plumbing. Think it's important, but I don't understand it. Standards are very important. I cannot function without it. So let's see what your opinions are on that. And obviously there's no right or wrong answer here.
Guys, and as I said, we cannot see who is saying what. We only get a percentage answer, so we can see more or less where you guys are at with your mindset.
While you're busy there, I can just also apologize in advance. Sorry, we've been having notoriously bad internet service at the moment. One moment it's perfect, the next moment it drops away. So let's hope for the best for the rest of the session, that it will remain strong. If I go silent, I'll watch the chat window. I'll let you know. Well, if I go silent, just stay there. I'll reconnect and we'll carry on.
Okay, so it seems like everyone that wanted to vote has voted, so I'm going to close the poll. Then there you go.
And the majority said that very important, cannot function without it. And there's a fair percentage of you that says, think it's important, but don't understand it. Okay, so let's go through and see what else we come up with in this presentation. I'm going to try and manage the time so that we get through and have some time for a few questions afterwards. If you have any questions, there will be a spot for questions and answers at the end of the session. In the meantime, you're welcome to type up some questions for the organizer. So the first question, why standards? Why do standards exist? So I want to use a very simple example. If you recall that several years back when cell phones, before it was smartphones, cell phones were around and they started getting all better and better. You had to have a charger for every single phone. If you lose your charger, it was difficult. Well, if you wanted to buy an adapter, you had it was a mix. You can see on the inside that was a typical universal charger that you had to buy that side in order to charge your phone. Now with one little wire, you can do it. Okay, it's been developed a little bit since then. Maybe there's 2 or 3 options now, including the iPhones that always use their own thing. But I mean, this is a simple example of what standards does. It helps to standardize things. More specific, it helps to make sure that things work. One thing you never think twice. If you have a nut and a bolt, you get the bolt, you get the nut, you can see it's the right nut for the bolt, and it works. It fits tightly, it screws on securely, there's no cross threading. It is something that simple work. That's because of standards. I mean, it's possible to make so many different thread types. And previously in South Africa, there were when there was still a lot of metric and imperial threads mixed. You weren't always sure what you're getting. Now that South Africa is standardized on metric, that's what you get, and you simply know it works. Same with pipe sizes, pipe fittings, because everything's based on the same sizes and same standards. You can grab some stuff off the shelf, and it will work. Same with electricity, electrical outlets worldwide. For the different requirements of the different countries, you know that you cannot mix and match, and that if we'll use that in example later on, where we will get back to some of the electrical stuff. But it makes sure things works. I think even more importantly, because standards cover your blind spot. Now, one of the concepts to understand, part of what I've done in my career previously, I developed products. Now, when you get into the development of a product, you have a certain focus. I've worked a lot on gas appliances. And I mean, you're trying to solve this problem of getting this flame to burn exactly right, and getting the right heat values from it and the right visual effect and things like that. And you might be forgetting some of the safety aspects, aesthetic aspects, some of the important electrical aspects that you just didn't think about because you were focused on one area of the design. If you work with a standard, it forces you to acknowledge everything and to cover your blind spot. That part that you didn't see, it addresses that. I mean, that same principle applies with installations. I mean, I've used a product design as an example, but exactly the same applies with installations. As a plumber, you might be more familiar with certain areas of installation than others. But if you follow the standards, you know that will help you cover everything, even your blind spot that you had. It's addressed in the standard, and it will help you do the things right. So what exactly is a standard? It's easy to talk about standards. We know it's this book that you buy and it costs a lot of money. But I mean, what's a standard? And if you want to oversimplify it, a standard is a checklist. It's a list of requirements. It's simply a book with a lot of requirements in there that a product, a system, whatever, has to comply with. And you can use it in a checklist, or use it as a checklist. I want to quickly discuss about what's in the standard. We said there's requirements, but what type of requirements will you find in the standard? Especially when you look at product standards, or standards for an item like a tap and so on. So the standard, I think safety is one of the obvious things we know. You want to make sure that this product cannot harm anybody. It won't. There won't be any sharp edges that will cut you. It won't allow water that will scald you, whatever. All sorts of safety aspects is addressed in standards. Compatibility, obviously, that's part of the example we've used. Threaded. Make sure the 2 thread types are matching, and it will be compatible with all other bolts out there. User information, don't underestimate that. I've heard so many people complain about it's such a simple requirement, it's less important than the rest, and by far not. Yes, sometimes there are some user information that's not that important. But I mean, if you don't tell the user what the product is for, if you don't tell the user how to use it, where it is applicable or not, it can sometimes have dire consequences. Functionality is a obvious one. I mean, if you have a tap, make sure it can give you water. If there's a geyser, can it heat water? If it's a telephone, can it make calls? How functional is it? Does it work? And that is, there's often a lot of interesting requirements that goes into testing the functionality. But then there's also something that is easily overlooked and critically important. This is what we call reasonable abuse. And I think one of the best examples I can use in the South African environment is we all walk around with big spanners. We don't want to suckle. If there's a leak, I'm going to tighten that thing to make sure that leak goes away before it's necessary for me to undo and redo things. So it's reasonable that we might over tighten things from time to time. The question is, what happens with that component? If it's a tap or it's a pipe or it's whatever it is. One example, for instance, on gas cylinder valves. What happens when you over tighten a gas cylinder valve? It's a safety critical item. You do not want the gas to be released. So one of the requirements there, for instance, is if you over tighten it and something breaks, it must still be safe. No gas must be released. It's fine that it can break, but when it breaks, it must remain safe. So that's a type of requirements that you do get into standards in general. Some of the principles of the requirements that goes into standards are also important to understand. So the one principle to understand is design-based requirements versus performance-based requirements. In some standards, the requirement is very explicit. It will say, well, the example on your screen at the moment, materials. If you use brass, I mean the two components you see there, copper and zinc, that's what is used to make brass. And there might be an explicit requirement that says when you use brass, this is what the brass needs to comply with. 1, 2, 3. It's very explicit. Some areas it might say you shall use brass because it's a known quantities, known reactions. Other requirement is much more performance based. It gives a lot of freedom to the designer of the system, of the installation, and so on. The performance-based requirement is where there won't be a requirement that says, well, this is the orifice size of the tap and the screw thread and the size of the opening. It will just say, you know what, if you apply this pressure and the tap is fully open, this is the amount of flow that needs to come out. So no matter how you design this tap, as long as it can give the flow, it complies with the requirement. Then, I mean, these are the two extremes. Many of the requirements and standards are somewhere in between, half specific about the design, half performance based. It depends on what's applicable. Another concept to understand of standards is that when something is tested, it doesn't always relate directly to real life. Sometimes it is just too complex, but there are some references that is known to work. Corrosion testing is one of those things. So there are no laboratory condition tests that when you've done this test, you can go out and guarantee to say, you know what, it passed a 100-hour salt fog test and therefore it will last 10 years in real life. I mean, that simply doesn't work. It doesn't happen. But there are there have been so many of these tests done that there's references that they know, you know what, something that can withstand 100 hours in the salt fog environment will be able, is most likely good to be used in a certain environment. And therefore there are often a test like this that you can't relate directly to real life, but it does give a good indication of the quality and with that the product is at least good enough to be used. So the example on your screen, I spoke about the salt fog cabinet. I mean, this is one of the tests that's being done. A little plate gets painted, put in a salt environment, in other words, an environment that will really accelerate corrosion for a number of hours. typical test times are 100 hours, 200, 250 hours, and so on. And then you do a test on the paint afterwards to see whether they work corrosion or not, or how much. That's just an interesting side comment. One of the things that's important to understand, and we'll get back to this late in the session, is what does compliance to the standard mean? I mean, if you want to say something complies with the standard, it means it complies with everything. The pass rate is 100%. So a standard, as we said, is a list. It's a list of requirements. The standard provides a list of minimum requirements. It's not a rating. It's not a book that says which product is better than another one. It is something that says if all taps are tested to the same standard, every tap that comply with the minimum requirements. It's at least good enough. It does not say which tap is better than which one. And it's for that reason that you have to have 100% pass rate, because all the requirements are a minimum requirement. You have to comply with every single one of those requirements in order to be able to claim that the product does comply. So we've been running through this quite fast. I'm trying to check the time, and I hope I don't lose you along the way. But put your questions in if there's any questions or anything you want me to repeat. So we quickly look at different types of standards. So it's easy to just say standard, and we know, well, there are standards that refer to products, installation, and processes. So let's explain what that means. A product standard is typical where you refer to a item, a valve, a bottle, gives a thermostat. There will be a standard written for that valve, for that product, with all the requirements related to that single product and that product on its own. I think this is fairly common, straightforward. Then you get what we call installation standards. Now this is, you might have several products, but when you install these products in a system, you install them in practical use, there might be different things to follow, different processes, different ways of connecting, how far they're supposed to be apart. Should it look like that pretty installation on the image that you say? Will that work? So the installation standard gives all the requirements to make sure that the complete system, the complete installed system, will actually be functional and will at least work, do what it's supposed to be doing. Then you get process or system standards. Now a system standard, I think one of the most commonly ones that gets advertised is ISO 9001. What does that mean? I mean, the system does not refer to a product. It does not refer to an installation. It refers to a process, what happens. This is typically a production line in a factory. Will have ISO 9000 listed. It makes sure that people are, or it makes sure that the process is consistent. What rules have you put in place to make sure the process is consistent? So in a factory, for instance, how do you make sure that the operator always uses the correct part on the correct vehicle? How do you make sure that the operator, when he tightens the bolts, tightens it so that it wouldn't come loose in use, and it doesn't strip when he over tightens it? How do you make sure the operator is trained? How do you make sure that when something changes, or when, let's say, the operator isn't there today and somebody else has to do the work, how do you make sure that that person will do it correctly? That's a type of requirements that goes into a system standard like ISO 9001. There are many other system standards I'm not going to spend too much time on. ISO 14000, for instance, is all about environmental conditions, what's good for the environment. There's a very pertinent one, 17025. That's for test laboratories. How does test laboratories make sure that the test they do is consistent, always give the same result? And certification bodies, ISO 17065. If you certify a product, give it a stamp of approval. How do you make sure that is done consistently? It's all system standards. It's all about consistency. So, what do you have to remember? What do you have to take away from this? If somebody have to understand that a system standard is not about the product. It's not about product quality. It is about consistency. If you're planning to make bread like the one on the right hand side, you can do that within a factory that is ISO 9000 certified. And you will get consistently bad bread if you do it that way. If your system is designed to bake good bread and you follow the ISO 9000 system, then you will consistently get good bread. It's about the consistency. It's not about the quality of the product. So I've seen many people advertising, oh, this thing must be perfect because it is ISO 9000. Sorry, that says nothing about the product quality. So how does the South African standards compare to international standards? Are we little area on our own that just does what we want to do in isolation or not? So yes, with the history of South Africa, we've done a lot of things on our own. We were forced to. Not going into the reasons, that's just the facts of how things developed. So there were a lot of homegrown standards, and even today, some of the standards are written locally by local experts, created from scratch. There are a big tendency is to adapt from international standards as well. In other words, that's a process where locally when the standard is developed locally, we look at what the standard is in Australia, what is the standard in Europe, what is the standard in North America, for instance. Take the requirements, adapt it so that it fits the South African condition, and write our own standard that are similar. So that's a process that is often followed. The one thing that happens more and more often is to adopt the standard as is. In other words, we take the standard, say, you know what, this standard we can use exactly as is in South Africa, and it simply gets printed, adopted in South Africa. A lot of, especially the plastic pipe standards in South Africa, have been done this way. So it's exactly the same standard that is used worldwide, simply adopted to South Africa, reprinted with a SANS cover. And then something that is also that is also happening quite often is adapted and amended, or adopted and amended. And I'll give you some example just in the next slide. So just one comment on this. A lot of the South African standards, or most South African standards, does align pretty well with international. I mean, South Africa agreed to the World Trade or signed some World Trade agreements, so that we're not going to create standards that's a barrier to trade that keeps other products out of our country. What makes our standard unique is simply the unique conditions in South Africa, in our country. That's the only things that really makes it unique. But for the rest, it pretty much aligns with the type of requirements that you find internationally, similar requirements. Some things just develop separately. There are obvious differences, but I can safely say that we are very, very, it's very well aligned with the international requirements. ISO stands for International Standards Organization. So SABS has been one of the founding members of this ISO, International Standards Organization. As they're still a member, still represent ISO in South Africa. And as a result of that as well, any ISO standards gets adopted into South Africa quite easily. The agreements have already been in place. As I say, a simple example where we have to amend international standards, and I use a very, very, as I say, stupid example. Electricity. We know that the USA, for instance, use 110 volt electricity supply. In South Africa, it's 230 volts. All electrical appliances doesn't work. I mean, you normally has to design the appliance so that it works on the correct voltage. So a light bulb that is designed in the USA to work on 110 volts. What will happen when you screw it in at South Africa? It won't work. It will blow up. Which means that you cannot just adopt an international standard and say if it's good in USA, it will be good in South Africa. You often have to take the standard, look for it's what they call national deviations. Look for the national deviations and make the small changes so that you can make sure that when a product in South Africa complies with the national deviations, in other words, it gets tested on 230 volt, not on 110 volt, then it will still be safe. Okay. So that's a bit of a background about standards, what it is, what goes into the standards, where it comes from. I would like to ask you another question. So considering what we've just said, and your perception going forward, and now think about all products, not only plumbing products. The legal status. Must products comply with their national standards? What does the law say? What do you think? If you can go ahead and enter that poll. And I see the poll is open.
Sorry, Arman, you caught me a bit by surprise there.
No problem.
Right, seems that people are at least listening. They are quite quick to vote on this one. I'm just going to give it a few more seconds. All right, there you go.
Okay, and there's a overwhelming majority that says all products must comply to their standards, and a few that says no, it doesn't have to. So would you like to know the real answer? And as soon as I get control of the screen back, I will tell you the real answer. Let's go to the next slide. And the answer was actually no. Any standard, when a standard is published, it is voluntary. All standards are written as a voluntary document. Anybody can choose to have their product comply to the standard or not. That's how all standards start their life. So on the right hand side, that horrible text that you see there, the reason why it looks like that is I've copied it straight out of the Government Gazette. For some reason, all the government gazettes with the Standards Act looks like this. If you find a better copy, send me one as well. But in any case, so I want to quote out of the Standards Act. The Standards Act is the act that governs the SABS. It's the act that explains how standards work, what has to be done and what not. So this part out of the Standards Act, Section 28, is all about how a standard is linked into the legislation. So it's not explicit in saying all standards are voluntary. I mean, the norm is it is voluntary until it is made legal by an act of Parliament. So if you see the highlighted section under Section 28, may be incorporated into law. So what that section says is any standard that is written may be incorporated into law. So if somebody decides, some government department decides, for some reason, this standard may be incorporated, there's rules to that, and I encourage you to get the act and to go and read it. But if it is, it may be incorporated into a law. There's some conditions being explained, but focus on the yellow part because this is the most common situation. What that says is that when a standard is incorporated into legislation, whenever that standard gets amended, that new amendment becomes valid, becomes the law, which is exactly the case in our national standards, with the plumbing standards, for instance. So if a legislation, well, we'll get to that. Let me not jump ahead of myself here. So the important thing is the Act makes explicit provision for the fact that standards are intended to be incorporated into legislation when necessary, but not always. And that if they are incorporated into legislation, they most of the time, whenever that standard is amended, the amendment is the part that, or is then a legal requirement. So, as we said, all standards are voluntary when first published. Then some standards remain voluntary permanently. Some standards are called up in legislation, and I'll show you an example now, and some standards become legislation, for instance, a VC document. I will show you some example of that now as well. What is important to note on this slide is the bottom two options. Doesn't matter which process or how a standard gets incorporated into legislation. The legal status are exactly the same. They are both standards that have to be complied with. The only difference is the enforcement mechanism. Who polices that and who makes sure that it complies or not. But the legal status are exactly the same. So one example of a standard that has been incorporated into legislation, we call it by reference. And I'm sure you should all be familiar with this. This was on 8th of June 2001, Government Notice R509 that had included this paragraph. At the stage when they included this, the references were still to SABS. There were a bit of a name and numbering change that happened. I'll get to that. But this is the paragraph, section 14, that says that every consumer installation must comply with SABS 0252, which is today's SANS 10252 for water supply, and SANS 10254 for geyser installations. It has been incorporated into legislation, and every amendment of these standards remain a legal requirement. Then an example from the plumbing industry for a VC document, the other way of incorporating it. So this was 16 May 2014 already. This is the standard or the government gazette that introduced VC 9006. Now, without going into all the nitty-gritties, this VC is basically saying that SANS 151, the geysers, this is the way that geysers were made a legal requirement, to say that all geysers must have a certain energy efficiency requirement and it must comply with all the requirements of SANS 151. Okay, so that is the two examples of how it became legislation. The one difference between the two that I can quickly say, the VC documents is the responsibility of the NRCS, the National Regulator of Compulsory Standards, is the organization that have the authority to police that. They are responsible to make sure that all products, all geysers comply. They do exactly the same for electrical appliances, food products, all the VC standards. Let's quickly get to the process, and I think this is quite an important part that we want to get to. So where does the standard come from? Who decides what goes into a standard? Are there a room full of experts somewhere locked in a room that come up with these things? Are there people with political connections that make the decision and force everybody else to use that? Again, this straight referred out of the Standards Act. I want to encourage you. That screen you have there is a screen on the SABS website. There's an area there, free downloads. If you go into the free download site, you can download the SABS national norm as published in 2018. That is the document that will explain everything about how standards are written. If you're looking for the loopholes in it, that's where you go and have a look at it. If you want to understand it, please go there, verify what I'm telling you today is correct. So again, back to a section of the Standards Act. The Standards Act, section 23, is the part that instructs SABS to create the national norm, and the national norm describes how standards are written. Then the following section explains, and this is what says the process of standards writing. And it explains a few important things about when a standard gets written. it explains that national standards must take in cognizance or must acknowledge latest technologies or latest technological developments must be considered in standards. So it has to remain up to date. That's why standards are reviewed on a regular basis. You're forced to go back to the standards to see, are they still relevant? Do they still talk about the technologies of today? Or are they ancient and only talk about things that happened long time ago? It's important that it have to be in the interest of all parties. Highlighted that part that refers to all parties. A standard is not written for a specific person. It's not written for the plumber. It is not written for the homeowner. It's not written for the insurance company or for IOPSA or for PRB or for whatever. It's all parties. The law says all parties must be considered when a standard is written. It uses a generic term, all parties. So this really encompasses, well, every party that has got any interest in that product or installation or process. It's also instruction by law that the standards must be harmonized with international standards. This is what we discussed earlier. They must be similar, they must be comparable to international standards. They shouldn't create unnecessary barriers between the local and the international standards. And I must say, from all the standards that I've seen, they pretty much are harmonized with international standards. A very important one is the last one. There has been an appropriate national consensus building process. In other words, critically to understand, the law says a standard cannot be forced onto anybody. Everybody has the right to influence the standard. Everybody's got the opportunity to contribute. No single person, no single entity can manipulate or force this down on anything. And well, obviously, no standard, it's impossible to do that. If you read the national norms, follow the process, you'll see that it's impossible for any one person or one party to manipulate and to enforce his will on a standard. So who is responsible for the standard? The responsible party is the National Technical Committee. Maybe let me just say at this stage again, remind you, what I'm explaining here is I'm not going through the national norms line by line. I'm trying to explain the principles. So I hope the principles make sense. If you go through that line by line, you'll get a much more in detail, clearer picture. But the technical committee is the committee that takes that is responsible to write the standard. They carry the responsibility and the accountability for the standard that has been written. Who is on this committee? Who is on this technical committee? So first of all, SABS manages this. This is part of the work that SABS does. They need to manage that. But SABS has got one seat around the table. They do not decide what goes into that standard. As we say, all applicable parties has to be represented. So there are industry bodies like IOPSA. You see, I've scratched through PRB. PIRB are not on a technical committee. PRB has got no voting right on technical committees. So PRB has got no say in any of these standards whatsoever. IOPSA, yes, as the Institute of Plumbers, they are represented as one seat around the table. There are also consumer bodies, other industry bodies. I've just used those examples, but there's other industry bodies, government, scientific bodies. As I say, consumer bodies, they often as part of these technical committees. So it's a big variety. It's not a limited list. Anybody that can show that they have an interest in this can be there. It's not a person. That is why the rule says it is representative bodies. Otherwise, you're going to get the whole country want to sit around the table. So work through formal structures to get representation on these technical committees. Some members, a quick note on O members and P members, it's participating members and observer members. Normally the observer members are people that doesn't vote, but they want to follow what happens. That's often often bodies that apply or that has to apply the rules, that need to be able to comment but doesn't vote or change the rules. They will give feedback to the meeting, but they will not vote on any of the rules that goes into that. A technical committee, however, does not necessarily have the expertise to work on the standard. So when there's real technical work that needs to be done, that technical committee will appoint a working group. They will appoint subject matter experts. Now, these experts there's no limit to them. That can be anybody. It can be technical experts, legal, business, testing, what have you. Again, SABS isn't even always represented on these meetings. They need to make sure that it follows the correct process. But these meetings, people that serve on these working groups does not represent the country. They represent their technical expertise when they sit on these meetings. And that's the people that does the real work. So let me quickly go through and just explain the process. So what happens? Step one, or let's say what happens when a standard needs to be revised or a new standard needs to be written. I see I need to go slightly faster. So step one, the technical committee appoints a working group. They appoint the people that says, you are the experts, you go and work and come back and give us an answer. So the working group does this through an iterative process. They write, go back, debate. Normally it takes quite a few meetings where they sit, debate everything, document what they've done, do their homework, come back, debate it further, work through the document, up to the point where they have a document that they believe is correct. The standard looks the way that it's supposed to. Remember, this working group can work on a part of a standard or a full standard. It's not limited. So once the working group are happy with the work they've done, they vote on it, making sure that that all the working group members agree. Remember, this is a consensus process. Everybody has to agree. It's not a vote. We don't say, well, we choose whoever is they have the most votes. You have to debate until everybody agrees. So when the working group is happy, when they voted, if they're not all happy, they go back and go through the process. When they're happy with the document, that document gets presented to the technical committee. This is the people with the responsibility to make the decision. If the technical committee is not happy with the document, they refer it back to the working group. They might even appoint a different working group to look at it. If the technical committee feels that the work is correct, the standard is what it's supposed to be, it goes through an editing process to make sure all the language is correct and it says what it's supposed to say and there's no misinterpretations and things like that. And simply the language is used correctly. Very important for us technical people that someone else checks our spelling. But after it's been through that process, it goes out for a public comment stage. So everything has to go for a public comment stage for at least 3 months. This is a point where anybody in the public can add their comments to the document. So even if you feel that, you know what, I work with this, I didn't have the opportunity to comment on anything in this document. At this stage, you have the opportunity, you can comment, and the committee is obliged to evaluate and to consider the comments that you've made. If it's not accepted, it goes back, work needs to be done. If it is accepted, then it gets published. So what's the moral of the story that we learn out of this whole process of developing the standard? Remember, a standard is by the industry. Yes, but the image that I showed there says plumbing industry, not only the plumbing industry, it's all the interested parties. But the fact is, the plumbing standards are written by the plumbing industry as a whole. It is impossible for a single person to force his will onto a standard. It is impossible for a single organization to force his will onto a standard. It's well, yeah, as I say, it's simply not possible. And I'll be open with it. There's been many comments flying around about the PRB inserting themselves into the standards. It's impossible for the PRB to insert themselves to tell everybody that this is what the standard has to say. I mean, and frankly, the PRB is not even represented on these committees. A quick note on SABS. So this is what the heading said. We're going to talk about SABS, SANS. So what is the difference between SABS and SANS? SABS stands for South African Bureau of Standards. SANS stands for South African National Standard. So SABS is an organization, it's a building, it's a bunch of people sitting in that building on the photo there. That's who SABS is. SANS is the document, that is the national standard that we've just discussed. And there's a critical difference. SABS is the organization that is responsible for publishing the SANS standards, the South African national standards. That is why it's also important when you talk about requirements, we talk about products or we talk about SABS requirements or SANS requirements. Which of these statements are correct? I mean, due to history, people are often inclined to refer to SABS requirements, but the SABS doesn't have any requirements. It is the national standard as compiled by the National Technical Committee that has got the requirements. So there are no such thing as a SABS requirement. It's SANS requirements, South African National Standard requirements. Another thing that's good to understand is who is SABS and what are the different areas within the SABS. So SABS writes standards. The South African Bureau of Standards, the primary function is to make sure that there are standards and that the standards are written and published, the whole process we've just discussed. Then they have registered a separate company. SABS Commercial SOC is an independent company registered. Yes, they still belong to government, but that company performs testing and certification services. It is not, and they operate on exactly the same level as any other private testing and certification organization. Neither of these organizations has got any, or neither side of SABS has got any authority to decide what should be in the standard, to decide which product needs to be tested, and there's no law that says that anything has to be tested by them either. It's maybe important to just have a look. They say there's been a point in time, approximately the year 2000. They couldn't get the exact date, but it's around about the year 2000 that the big change happened, and the change were gradual. From 2000 round about, I think that towards 2008, the final changes were made. So prior to 2000, the SABS wrote the standard. They tested the standard. At that stage, I worked for SABS. I were in the technical committee that wrote the standards. I did the testing. I did the certification of the products. I were authorized to regulate it, to be able to go into the into any shop, take products off the shelves, and do whatever the regulator functions were. The national metrology standards were kept at SABS. That's a discussion on its own. And there were a level of public service. If the public phoned with questions, you were obliged to jump up and help sort it out. And that were government funded, almost fully funded. I mean, you were good. You had some revenue from industry, but that was a small part of the budget. Where it is now is SABS organization writes standards, and they get government funding for that. SABS Commercial, the commercial organization, does testing and certification. They do not get government funded for that. The regulatory function is a different organization now, a national regulator for compulsory standards. The metrology references are now kept by NAMISA, and I forgot what that stands for, National Metrology, somewhere in that. And the public service request I think that fell away somewhere along the line. Not sure where that is, if it's still in the picture. But the one thing that changed in that process is where standards were previously published as SABS standards, they are now published as SANS standards, to make the distinction that the SANS, the standard, belongs to public, belongs to the country. It does not belong to the organization. And please, if at this stage you get the impression that I'm anti-SABS, by all means, not. I mean, SABS is a brilliant and a good organization. I'm simply explaining where they really fit into the picture. I apologize, I see we're running late. There's only a few slides left and I'll go through them quickly. So compliance. The one question that came up is, how do you prove that the product comply? And who is allowed to prove that a product comply? There used to be a perception that products has to be tested by the SABS, although they are a great option to go for and to be used to verify that products comply. The law simply does not require that. I think there are one or two individual cases where there are legislation that says SABS has to, but that is minimal. Any commercial entity out there that wants to can test, and manufacturers has got freedom of choice. And this is a whole discussion on its own, how it can be done. There are even allowance made for international testings. South Africa as a country agreed to the international processes of accepting each other's test reports. So without wasting too much time on this slide, international tests can be accepted, but compliance to the SANS requirements is not compromised. You can't say, well, my product is tested in Europe to the EN standard. It's irrelevant if it hasn't been tested to the South African national standard. The backbone of any process of verification, verifying that the product complies, is testing. So testing is either testing in laboratory, or in the case of an installation, audit on the installation itself as a matter. But that physical action by a third party to verify is the backbone of everything. It starts there. Certification is a next step. That is where step 2 gets in. If you want to apply a certification mark like the SABS approved mark on a product, then the production has to be verified. Is the production consistent? That is connected to step 3, contractual agreements. In other words, this is where the company confirm that they will continue to produce. They confirm that there will be regular checks on the production and the products and so on, to make sure that there's ongoing verification of the product and ongoing, well, verification of the process and ongoing tests. And that leads to step 4, which is a certification being awarded, like the SABS mark or some of the ones on the previous slide as well. The certification is voluntary. There are no requirement that says the product must be certified. Okay. However, it's a good thing. It is definitely recommended because it gives you a very, very good indication. It builds a lot of trust that the third party verified that the product are compliant in fact. And that brings us to the last slide. It's very difficult to summarize everything that we've said today, because we've touched on quite a lot of things. I think some of the important things is standards are important because it's for us. We that use it get the benefit out of that. It helps cover your blind spot. I've made so many mistakes that I've learned to trust standards, and that really do cover your blind spot. The same apply with plumbing installations. If the installation is done as the standard requires, then no auditor can find anything wrong with it. The standards are not written by a person or a organization. It's impossible for that to happen. It is by the industry for the industry. And at the end of the day, when you want to verify compliance, a third party is necessary. The backbone of any verification starts with the testing, starts with a third party doing a verification. So sorry for taking too much of your time. But if there are any questions, I'm happy to stay as long as it takes to answer them.
Unfortunately, Herman, we do have to get off so the next webinar can start setting up their stuff. But what I can do is I can email the questions to you, and then you can answer them via email, if that is fine with you.
I'm happy to do that. So everybody that typed in a question, I'd be happy to respond to them by mail.
All right,
So I
then thank
apologize
you so much.
for running over time. I like to blame the internet, but I'm sure I could have done this a little faster as well. But thanks for joining. I hope that there was some value for you within this, and I hope you all have lots of fun for the rest of the evening.